This
is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're talking about a very controversial, current, and urgent topic in our democracy, but a topic with a long, long history. And this is, of course, the topic of race, and in particular, the role of race in the evolving politics of the Midwest, a part of the country that is always significant in choosing our national as well as state leaders, and a part of the country that's always the center of controversy. If we think back to the period of Joseph McCarthy, through the period of the conservative revolt in the 1990s and 2000s, to our current moment with racial protests and violence against protesters and others in Wisconsin, and of course evidence of horrible police brutality in the shooting of Jacob Blake 7 times by police just a few days ago. Much of the country is focused on this part of the state of Wisconsin right now. And we have with us, I think, one of the most thoughtful people I know, someone who brings a historical perspective, a personal perspective, and political activism to these questions surrounding race and democracy in the Midwest. My former student, though now he's really my teacher, Steve Olikara. Steve has been on our podcast a few times before. He's one of our favorite guests. He is, as I hope everyone knows, the founder and president of the Millennial Action Project, which, as I've been writing about in many places, I think the Millennial Project is doing some of the most important work to bring young people into our political system across party lines and to get them involved in voting and becoming candidates themselves. Steve has a distinguished intellectual career, a distinguished academic career. He's won numerous awards. The most important thing I want to stress today, though, is that he grew up the child of Indian immigrants in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so what we're going to talk about today is obviously a topic he studied, but a topic he's lived so close to his heart and so close to his experiences. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's always an honor to be on your show.
And we have with us, of course, to start out our discussion and set the scene, we have Zachary Suri's scene-setting poem. What's the title of your poem, Zachary?
A Recollection of the Discoverers.
Well, let's start recollecting.
When Black Hawk led his people to war across the plains of the Wisconsin, careened himself into history as one of the last resistors, the man determined not to give way, given up to amateur hockey logos and silly stickers on sidewalks. He was just an American discovering the ways of America. When my great-grandfather crossed the sea from Hungary and landed feet first in Detroit, crawled achingly towards Traverse City to sell from a cart to the native peoples, and then found himself a gas lamp salesman in Chicago, he was just a Jew discovering America. When Harold Washington came up from the deep South into the slums of South Chicago as a child, made his way to Congress, and breathed mournful breaths in the heavy streets, mayor of the Midwest, preacher of the promised future, he was dying, dead of a heart attack, and driven peacefully to his grave under more mournful breaths, a black man who managed to stake his claim to the Midwest. And they were all here in spirit long before Jacques Marquette, all here long before and long after the wheat and the corn. It grew from so many souls, so many promises that were given, so many taken away, and so many proven. It was this collection of wayward souls who discovered the Midwest. They were there from the very beginning, all of them, a succession of her tired, her hungry, her poor, but surely also her huddled masses yearning to breathe free, her huddled masses struggling to breathe, her huddled black masses shot in the back as they bent into the passenger seat of a car. They too discovered America.
Zachary, I'm amazed how you go from the Black Hawk War to Chicago politics to immigration and contemporary issues in Kenosha. What is your poem really about?
My poem is really about the complex nature of race in the Midwest and the many contradictions, opportunities, and oppression that has defined the Midwest and racial relations in the Midwest for the past 2 centuries.
Well, with that introduction, Steve, maybe it makes the most sense for us to start with a little bit of your experience. What was it like growing up as the child of immigrants from India in Milwaukee in the 1980s, as you did?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me on the show. And Zachary, as always, I'm blown away by your poetry. And you're right about the complex nature of race in the Midwest. And Jeremy, as you referenced, my parents came to Wisconsin not knowing what type of environment it would create for their children. But we were in suburban Milwaukee. And at the time, this region had about a 98% Caucasian racial makeup. So needless to say, my brother and I were different. We stood out a lot, being first-generation Americans and sons of Indian immigrants, and even, frankly, just being people of color in suburban Milwaukee. And that was in the context of a larger racial and political divide that I didn't fully appreciate until I was a bit probably close to the end of graduating from high school. And it was then that I started reading some of the great reporting in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and some other reports that had explained some of the larger divisions in the community. For those who are less familiar, the greater Milwaukee area is the most segregated metro area in the entire country along lines of race. And you see disparities around income and housing and education as well. And that tracks along political lines as well. The greater Milwaukee area is also the most politically segregated metro area in the country. So you can go from the bluest of the blue area in downtown Milwaukee and within just a few miles be in some of the reddest of the red areas in the suburban areas. They call it the WOW counties. And I'm personally from one of those W's, Waukesha County. And so that has a lot to do with the experience growing up. When I have a number of experiences when I was in grade school where my peers couldn't figure out where to place me racially or ethnically, and they would always have that uncomfortable question, and they would try and say it, but do it so in a very awkward way, and they would say, "So what are you?" And I'd explain my background, and they were a little confused by it, and they would just say, "Well, I'm American." Mm-hmm. And I would, of course, always respond by saying, "Well, I'm American too. I was born in this country." And a bit later in probably middle school and high school would sometimes be teased for different aspects of Indian culture, Indian food. And the thing I took away from those experiences was that these comments would virtually never come from a bad place. Usually it was they were trying to communicate and just didn't necessarily have the language to do so. I'll share one quick story. When I was in my 9th grade biology class, my teacher asked the class, who here has traveled outside of the country? And in a class of roughly maybe 30 or so students, 2 people rose their hand, myself and another student. And he asked, "Where have you been?" And I responded that I've been to India and Europe and a number of other places. And the other person responded by saying, "Oh, well, I've been to the Bahamas." And so that just gives you a little picture of just at that point, the exposure that people had to cultures outside of America. And at the end of the day, I think one of the things I took away from that experience especially when I got to college and I was very engaged in diversity and race issues, is that we have to approach these conversations with a high degree of empathy and a high degree of our humanity and trying to really understand where people come from. And while I was in college, I gained a lot more of the language of how to have conversations amidst different races. But I also think growing up in Brookfield, it gave me a sensitivity. Brookfield is in suburban Milwaukee, a sensitivity where a lot of white people in Wisconsin are where they're coming from, and how we can start to build some bridges of cooperation.
That's such a revealing story of your own experiences, Steve. Why, if we can step back a second, why is Milwaukee so segregated? People think about cities like Chicago or Los Angeles as having issues of segregation. Why Milwaukee?
Well, there's an interesting history there. One dynamic that happened is as you had the Great Migration and you had African Americans migrating north towards the Midwest. They arrived in Chicago and then later in Milwaukee, precisely at the time that a lot of the manufacturing base in this region of the country was collapsing. You had more and more manufacturing jobs being shipped overseas. You had the industrial sector really getting hollowed out. And so just as African Americans were getting settled here in Milwaukee, they immediately had the rug kind of lifted out of their lives, and they weren't able to get the same economic opportunities. And then you layer on top of that a history of redlining, of what I call educational gerrymandering, where the districts were lined up intentionally to segregate along lines of race. And you have these compounding factors that ultimately led to this deep segregation that you see here today. And efforts to try and kind of break open that segregation is often met with a lot of resistance. And because our politics is so partisan, often met with just utter partisanship. And so those are some of the factors that I think led to the segregation in Milwaukee. And it's not uncommon in a lot of Midwestern cities. In these studies that show the most segregated metro areas in the country, cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit are usually in the top 5.
Yeah, I mean, what's also interesting too is that the Midwest has in many ways been the center of progressive activism, at least in the early half of the 20th century. How do we reconcile the historical progressiveness of the Midwest, and in many ways Midwesterners seeing themselves as more progressive than their peers across the country, with the racial tensions and divisions in Milwaukee and across the Midwest?
Well, that's a great point, Zachary. I think, I draw a lot of lessons about politics from the progressive era in Wisconsin. And you're right that we've had this progressive history. We had people like Fighting Bob LaFollette. We had Gaylord Nelson and others who had a strong focus on rooting out corruption in politics and preserving the environment. And I think, the degrees of immigration that Wisconsin had, particularly from minority or people of color communities, that was a more recent phenomenon that happened, in my estimation, probably in the 1970s and 80s. And so that has, I think, presented a unique challenge. But I think even if you go further back in the 20th century, when you had a lot of Irish and Polish and Germans coming to Milwaukee, they had their own struggles with trying to kind of integrate and build one community in Milwaukee. And that relates to another interesting dynamic that I see in Wisconsin and across the Midwest, which is you hear this phrase a lot: Midwest nice, Wisconsin nice, Wisconsin hospitality. And those dynamics are real. For anyone who's grown up, say, in the Midwest and then travels out to the coasts, you immediately sense that there's a difference in culture, a difference in welcoming and inviting, and just frankly saying hi to strangers in an elevator or on the sidewalk. And so Wisconsin actually does have this history of civil dialogue, of trying to work together across lines of difference and having less vitriolic rhetoric. It's really been in the past, definitely in the past 10 years, but in some ways over the last 20 to 30 years, where we've seen this worsening partisanship. And there are a lot of structural forces for that. I was talking just a couple weeks ago with someone who identifies as a progressive Republican out of that Bob LaFollette progressive era tradition in northern Wisconsin. And he was saying, once the special interest money came in and infected Wisconsin politics, that's when the divisiveness really got worse and ultimately metastasized into the dynamics we're seeing, over the last couple decades. And then I think one other force came in, and that was a politics that was explicitly about division. I think the Scott Walker campaign in 2010 really exploited this dynamic. He knew that the greater Milwaukee area was highly divided along race and politics. He knew that there was a conservative radio media infrastructure that he could tap into. So his political strategy and you can make your own ethical judgment of whether this is right or wrong, was focused on amping up his own base and turning out that vote, as opposed to building a much wider tent. And in many ways, that became the playbook for the Trump campaign in 2016. And so those dynamics where you have political leaders who are not trying to represent the entire state or bring together the state, but instead trying to represent their party, then further amplifies the divisions in the state. And it's, to me, just heartbreaking that the polarization narrative in Wisconsin has completely, subsumed, I think, the Wisconsin nice narrative. And I think we need to turn that around.
Absolutely. And you've been doing a lot of work, I think, across party lines to do that, working with legislators from both parties, et cetera. Steve, why is it that Wisconsin and other Midwestern states, this is true for Michigan, Ohio, and others, why is it that they seem to bat back and forth between progressive and, shall we say, anti-progressive, almost xenophobic positions? You think about, even going back earlier, the experience of having a Joe McCarthy from the state of Wisconsin, and then having a Gaylord Nelson, or parts of Wisconsin and other states that voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. How do we understand this flipping back and forth?
Well, I think one key dynamic that has simultaneously played out during that period of time, especially as you mentioned, the voters who supported Obama and then switched to Trump, the Midwest is the epicenter for that voting pattern. And Wisconsin, specifically southwestern Wisconsin, which is primarily a farming region of the state, rural area, has the highest concentration of voters who supported Obama twice and then switched to Trump in 2016. And one of those important dynamics is the extent to which voters across the political spectrum have become disenchanted with the political establishment. So in a place like the Driftless in that southwestern part of Wisconsin, it's the political divide isn't always a left versus right. It's more of an establishment versus anti-establishment type dynamic. And one thing we saw in 2016 was a lot of voters who became really frustrated with the business of government, who might have supported Obama, were willing to take a chance on Trump to really try and disrupt the system. And Trump did a very effective job at reaching out to the disillusioned voters across our state. And that's one reason why Wisconsin became, as some people described, the tipping point state in 2016. And so I think when there's this degree of disillusionment and disenchantment, it, I think, starts to bring out a version of ourselves where we start to have grievances and resentments along a variety of issues. If our farm has just closed down, on my podcast, Meeting in Middle America, quick plug there.
Great. It's a great podcast.
We just interviewed a couple writers who spend a lot of time in the western part of the state trying to understand the real pain and suffering being faced by farmers who have, in many cases, lost their farm, are being forced to find new lines of work, or losing their sense of identity. You're seeing the suicide rate among farmers just increase at alarming rates. And that disenchantment can be preyed upon by politicians who are interested in stoking those fears and anxieties. And we have, and Jeremy, you know more about this than I do, but we have a long history in our country, and especially in the 20th century, of politicians and political movements that seek to prey on our fears and our grievances. And our mutual friend, Kathy Kramer at the University of Wisconsin, published a really powerful book about this dynamic, The Politics of Resentment, which I think does a good job of trying to explain this dynamic. And so, getting to your question about race, in that type of context, a political message about racial resentment, about economic resentment, is extremely potent. And my own personal view is that in these times of disenchantment and disillusionment, and moments of great polarization and now political tribalism, we need political leaders who are able to embody a culture of empathy, a culture of humanity, a culture of love. And by love, I'm referring to what Dr. King referred to as the agape love. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to like everyone or have affection for everyone, but you have to love everyone as children of God. That's what he was trying to get at. And that politics is revolutionary in my opinion, but I think it's increasingly rare today. And I think the thing that keeps me hopeful is that amidst all of this turbulence, there might be a political movement that can seek to bring out, as Abraham Lincoln said, our better angels.
And there's such a profound point in that, as you and I have discussed many times, and as the scholarship I think shows very clearly, social movements become successful political movements when they're built on love and hope and healing. That's what the civil rights movement was all about. It's what abolitionism was about. It's what the women's movement was about in many ways. It's what the gay and lesbian and LGBTQ movement have been about. It's also what movements for economic fairness have been about as well. This discussion, and you've shared so much that's so valuable for us, Steve, has done exactly what we like to do on this podcast, which is contextualize our current moment. How, with this rich context you've given us a feel for it as well as the studied analysis of it. How do you come to look at these horrible events in Kenosha, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and how do you understand that event and all the controversy about it in this context that you've given us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when an event like this shooting of Jacob Blake happens, it's you're so right, Jeremy. It's happening in a larger context. There's a reason why thousands of people have been protesting what happened in Kenosha and have in many ways been protesting throughout the summer after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. And it's happening. It's like you have this puddle of gasoline, and then finally you put you light a match and throw it in the gasoline, and it just lights this fire. And that's in many ways what's happening right now. People in the communities of Wisconsin and Kenosha and many other communities feel like we've reached a breaking point in our lifetimes, and that the time for action is now. Now, one of the challenges when this happens is how do we, as we were just now talking about, how do you embody a politics of humanity and empathy when people are so afraid and there has been this violence? And we heard these unfortunate, tragic stories about the killing of Jacob Blake, additional killings during the protests of people who self-identified as a militia and said they were going to keep law and order, but instead they created less law and less order and created more chaos by killing people. That just stokes more fear and more anger in the community, and eventually it has a spiraling effect. One thing that gives me some hope right now is that you're seeing the community trying to rebuild, and even today, amidst President Trump visiting the community, you're seeing Jesse Jackson and other leaders trying to kind of heal the community. They're doing things like giving out free haircuts today. Their community members are helping to rebuild businesses that were damaged over the last couple weeks. And that process of rebuilding is a metaphor in many ways, because I think, in these types of movements, and this is where Millennial Action Project seeks to have a unique contribution, is we need to have builders. We need to have people who can help once an issue has been highlighted and demonstrated across all the airwaves and across all the media, that we can translate that into action. And unfortunately, these calls for action, and we saw recently the Milwaukee Bucks and the NBA, going on strike, and you're saying the Wisconsin legislature needs to meet. Well, a lot of NBA players and others are now realizing is that we have a broken political system. The moment we saw those calls, I got this pit in my stomach, because I was thinking they're going to see just how broken the Wisconsin legislature is, and in many ways our political culture, when we don't have the political bridging muscles in order to overcome the deep-seated partisan divide and hatred that exists. And so when there's a moment like this around racial injustice, or you consider after the Parkland shooting a moment around gun violence, and people wonder, why can't we do something about this? We have to uncover those reasons why our political system and in many ways the health of our democracy is not what it needs to be. And what we try to do with Millennial Action Project is, over the course of years and years of building relationships, of building trust, of building those political bridge building muscles, be able to start responding to these urgent issues and actually push bipartisan legislation over the finish line. And I think that's the type of politics that we need to see more of.
That's so compelling, Steve, but I want us to get the other side of the argument on the table and hear you respond to it. As many people know, Kenosha actually has a very strong movement of people that's long existing, right, who are very critical of those on the left and blame the political left, blame political movements, blame minorities for the difficulties they've had. The most obvious case of this is, of course, the sheriff, who I think a number of months ago, right, was recorded as saying, and this video people can find online, basically talking about how the problem was these inappropriate people in the area of different backgrounds, often African Americans, who he said were undermining the city by causing violence, bringing radical politics, acting in inappropriate ways. And then he blamed Democratic legislators, particularly the new governor, for restricting business and all sorts of other things. That's not a caricature. That's what some say. That this sheriff was elected with 55% of the vote in the area. What's your response to those arguments that this is external radicalism undermining a good community of Wisconsinites that just want to go about living as they want to, and people like Jacob Blake, who have criminal records, shouldn't be driving around with knives in their vans?
Well, one thing that's, I think, tough for our entire community here is we still haven't gotten a substantive explanation from either the police or the Wisconsin Department of Justice that's investigating the shooting of why lethal force in the form of 7 gunshots was required. And so I think the burden is pretty high to justify that. And so far, we haven't seen it. But to in a broader sense, to your question, Jeremy, to the extent that we've seen violence in the community, we've seen confirmed reports of people coming in from outside of Kenosha to try and rough things up and intentionally try and stoke, fear in the community. And I think that's really, really troubling because the media doesn't necessarily report on the origins of violence. They just report on the violence itself. And once that narrative gets out there, then it becomes extremely hard to advance efforts for racial justice. And that's exactly why Dr. King was so fervent about building a nonviolent movement for civil rights, because he knew that in order for this type of reforms around racial justice to move and to build a wide enough coalition for success, that you really have to do so in a dignified way, in a way that doesn't lead to the violence and destruction, but instead a more constructive and a more creative effort that brings out the best in people. He part of this philosophy of nonviolence was to make it so abundantly clear where the moral high ground is. And the moral high ground is around racial equality. And he knew that the narratives that would emanate from, protests were really important. And I think in many ways, with a lot of the violence and destruction that we've seen, the narrative is very, very much threatening to the prospects of real progress and real change. So I think that's a key dynamic here. And I think what's super important now, as we try and rebuild from this situation, is that we do reclaim the narrative and understand that issues of racial justice and equality are not partisan issues. I think Democrats who try and demonize people on the other side and say, you're all racist or you're all irredeemable is not helpful either, because that eliminates any possibility of building a bridge. So I think we need to transform the narrative. It needs to be more about constructiveness as opposed to deconstructiveness, and hopefully the sheriff can see that as well.
So what do you say, Steve? I know you've thought about this. What do you say to the store owner in Kenosha? Let's say it's a white store owner who really isn't very political at all. Someone who's not really a Republican or a Democrat, might have voted Republican last time, but might have voted Democrat before. That person's store has been looted and the windows have been broken, and he or she just wants to rebuild, and is skeptical of calls for political change, calls for social activism, because they seem to disrupt this struggling store owner's effort just to get his or her store opened, and maybe more police force is the best way so that there's safety in downtown for that store owner. What's your response to that position?
Well, I think it's a completely reasonable position to have, in that if you're a store owner, you're just trying to get by and you're barely making enough money to support your employees, and then you've all of a sudden gotten a $20,000 or $30,000 expense that you hadn't planned for, then what do you do? And it just speaks to the importance of why we need to we can't have any violence happening in these protests. I understand where the anger is coming from, but I was talking once with a biographer of Bobby Kennedy, trying to understand, like, how did Bobby Kennedy build this very unlikely diverse coalition for civil rights in 1968? And he was making this point, channeling Bobby Kennedy, that we can't have safe streets without justice, and we can't have justice without safe streets. And his point was to say to someone like the store owner, we can't truly have safe streets until we have the presence of justice on those streets. And without that, there will continually be a risk that things can spiral out of control. And in terms of the calls for more police or more the National Guard stepping in, to the extent that they can be helpful in a peaceful and constructive way, trying to reduce the not only violence but the sense of chaos on the streets. That's certainly helpful. But on the other hand, there won't truly be a kind of safe street or a peaceful street until we have justice, and that people who feel they've been people who have been just violently in a literal sense or violently in a metaphorical sense faced with injustice by our society have some type of recourse and some pathway to a greater sense where they have a stake in the community. So these issues are not easy, and I think we need to get to a place where we're approaching it with a much greater sense of, as I mentioned earlier, constructiveness and grace. And I think the voices that are so compelling right now are actually from the Blake family. And you just hear the grace that with Jacob Blake's mom and his other family members, and they're talking about the importance of coming together as a community. She quoted Lincoln as well, saying that a house divided cannot stand. I think that's the mentality and the spirit that we need. So both the shop owners and the protesters and the police and other members of community can all be working together towards a safer street corner and the presence of justice.
You're so right. I was so moved hearing his mother speak so evidently from the heart in her moment of grief that I can't imagine, calling on people to pray for everyone, to pray for not simply her family and those who have suffered, but to pray for the police officers. And that, as you said, that love of humanity, I think, came through in her as a voice shining amidst all the darkness.
Mm-hmm. I think what she was doing is something that Martin Luther King III recently mentioned to me at our recent Future Summit for Millennial Action Project. He was saying, I was asking him, how do you think Dr. King would respond to the polarization of this moment, both political and racial polarization? And he said, I think my father would be trying to call us to a higher order, a higher consciousness. And I think that's what Jacob Blake's mother was trying to do there.
Yeah, as we begin to close, I wanted to ask you, there are a lot of people asking right now, why now, right? Why are we seeing this moment right now? But I'd like to ask, why the Midwest? I mean, we've seen so much of this violence and so much of this tension play out in cities like Minneapolis and Kenosha, and in cities like Milwaukee and Madison and Chicago, we've seen mass protests and in some cases riots. Why the Midwest? Why not other parts of the country?
Zachary, that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to that, but I do have a few theories on it. I think, when you think about Kenosha, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, it is interesting that a lot of this is the real kind of battleground for racial justice has been in the Midwest. And I think, one theory I have on that is the context that we talked about earlier, that in many ways this was a reckoning that needed to happen, and that has been delayed for a long time in the Midwest. I mean, a community this divided is just not sustainable over the long term. And what's really striking that I've seen right now, and Jeremi and Zachary, I'm curious if you agree with this. Some of the images I've seen in Milwaukee and Kenosha, as well as from some of the protesters in Milwaukee, I don't know if you've heard, there's a group that marched on foot to Washington, D.C. To participate in the anniversary of the March on Washington.
Yes.
Some of the things they faced on that journey, they were sprayed with bullets. They were, yelled at with lots of very scary language. And you just wonder, we're seeing in real time, in real life in 2020, a lot of things that you were accustomed to seeing in black and white images in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think what that is provoking right now is a true awakening to understand that we have some deep-seated divisions and racial injustices in our country, and that reckoning has come. And in many ways, I think it's been more acute and more delayed in the Midwest. At least that's my theory on that. And again, it's just not sustainable over time. So, I think, as I was thinking about this, the group that was marching to DC, some of the things that they heard and that they saw, that they reported on, I think it's a big wake up call to a lot of people. And I think for a lot of people who've grown up in Wisconsin, who learned in their history classes that, you had the 1960s and the civil rights movement was really successful. I've heard people tell me that they thought racism was solved during that era of time. And now they're being rudely woken up that's not the reality right now.
Well, and those really thoughtful observations, I think, bring us back full circle. It does seem to me that one of the challenges, but also one of the great opportunities that you're tapping into through your work with the Millennial Action Project and all the other things you do, Steve, on the ground in Milwaukee and across the state, doing more, I think, than almost anyone else I know. It seems to me that one of the issues is that the composition of the state and the composition of the Midwest is changing. It's one of the parts of the country that have remained whitest for the longest time.
Yeah.
And of course, what white means has changed over time. Many of the Germans and Irish immigrants and Polish immigrants who came to the region were not initially considered white. But as we think of the 20th century, it has, as you pointed out at the start, remained one of the whitest parts of the country as the Southwest and the coasts have become more diverse. Texas is much more diverse than Wisconsin is right now, for example. And don't you feel that in some ways the hyperpartisanship is a consequence of people fearing they're losing control. This is what Kathy Kramer Walsh also talks about, people losing control, losing status from established families and established areas, but also the new possibility that there are so many Steve Olikaras out there, so many young people from various backgrounds who see a different future for the state. How do you negotiate those two elements of demographic change at this moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I think you've had communities that are now amidst a major racial and economic transformation, and those are, in my view, inextricably linked together. Because when you have, like in the Fox Valley of Wisconsin right now, you have so many paper mills that had sustained communities for decades, for maybe 40, 50, 60 years, that are now closing down. It's just a complete change of life, a change of your identity in many ways, because your sense of work and what you contribute to is very much wrapped up, in your identity. And then you add on top of that this kind of racial diversification that's happening as well, disproportionately, as you point out, Jeremy, in different areas. I think that creates a sense of anxiety. And then I think you layer on top of that, you have a government that is still really stuck in the past and unable to respond to the needs of the future. Then it just, I think, is a recipe for disaster. But I really do believe, as you point out, Jeremy, that a different way is possible. We spent 2 years doing this program across the state of Wisconsin called Red and Blue Dialogues. And because we're a nonpartisan organization, not affiliated with either political party, you were truly able to reach out and involve a lot of different people who have never really been in political conversations together in the same room. And talking about, in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, for example, talking about the local tech colleges and their involvement in helping to retrain and reskill the local employees, or talking in Green Bay about water conservation and how the entire community, Democrat, Republican, Independent, has a shared interest in a strong culture of water stewardship, brought out a different path in front of my eyes. And when to me, it was like a glimmer of what the future could look like, what the future of our democracy could look like. And once I saw those glimmers of hope, it was like intoxicating for me. I wanted a lot more of it, and I wanted to help build toward more of it. And so I know it's possible. And if we have, again, political groups and movements that aren't, like, their business model is not premised on conflict like so many are today, but instead focused on the issues and the solutions that can, help a community lift up, then I think a lot of those anxieties will kind of dissipate, because you start to see our success kind of wrapped up in each other. We see as Dr. King said, this web of mutuality. That sort of spirit can rise up. And so I know it's possible, but it's also in many ways the harder path to go. But I think it's what a diverse democracy like America really requires right now. That's why, like, these fights that we're involved in with Millennial Action Project and the stuff that you're doing, Jeremy, and yourself, Zachary, I think, like, this is, like, we're fighting for the concept of not just American self-government, but the idea of a diverse democracy existing not just in our lifetimes, but really thriving for many, many lifetimes to come. And if you just extrapolate, like, the current trends, eventually, as Jacob Blake's mother said, it's just going to collapse on the weight of its own divisions. But I've seen this other path emerge, and I think, by fighting this fight for a pluralistic, system where we respect our differences and we can work across lines of difference, that I think is going to be a recipe for success in this democracy.
Steve, I haven't heard anyone say it as well as you just did. I think you need to keep preaching about this, because you're preaching based on, first of all, a great deal of your own personal experience and sincerity, but also a great deal of wisdom from your research and all the organizational work you've done. Zachary, is this vision that Steve lays out, a vision of a young generation embracing pluralism, embracing political activism, and reaching out with love to those who see the world so differently, empathizing with those who come from different backgrounds, and backgrounds that often seem somewhat even offensive to the ideals of a younger, more diverse generation. Does that resonate with you? Do you think that's a path forward for your generation?
I think it is. I think we're moving to a point, especially as we become an even more interconnected world, where we can communicate with others hundreds and thousands of miles away in an instant. I think we are quickly becoming a much more pluralistic society, whether you like it or not. And I think what we have to recognize is that what makes our history so important is that we've gone through moments like this before, and we have found ways to move forward. And what we have to recognize is that the moment that we're in is unique, but it isn't purely unique. It also is derived in many ways from our own history. And we have to be able to look at our history and use the lessons, as Steve was doing with Martin Luther King Jr. and others. And we have to use those lessons to create a better future.
I think that's also very wise, Zachary, and it's a way in which this is the theme of our podcast. The way in which history matters so much by seeing that there's a long history, as Steve has described so well, that helps us to understand these difficult events in Kenosha and elsewhere. That also helps us to see a way out, because we can recognize that these are not events that have to happen. And we can live in a different way if we can address some of these long-term issues that reflect choices of another time, making new choices and getting involved in making those new choices. Steve, you have given us so much insight on a contemporary crisis. You've given us a way of understanding how the past relates to the present, and you've shown us a pathway forward. I want to encourage all of our listeners to go to the Millennial Action Project's website and find Steve and follow the work that Steve and the many other wonderful people in his organization are doing in Wisconsin and throughout the United States. And Steve, I hope we'll have you on again soon. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And Zachary, thank you for your wonderful poem, as always, and your stimulating insights and your inspiration for all of us. And of course, our biggest thanks, as always, is to our listeners. Thank you for joining us on This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.